The app was called Orbit. That should have been my first clue. It wasn't like the others. No swiping, no photos, no algorithm that matched you based on your favorite films and how much you pretended to like hiking. Orbit just asked 3 questions. What do you value most in another person? What does loyalty mean to you? If you could protect one thing in the universe, what would it be? I'd answered honestly, which I'd never done on a dating app before, and 3 days later a match appeared with no profile picture, and a name I couldn't pronounce and a message that said simply, "I would like to meet you. Are you brave enough?" I was 31 years old. I worked for an accounting firm in Midtown. I had a studio apartment in Flushing, and a cat named Gerald who hated me, and a mother who called every Sunday to remind me that my cousin Marco had already given her 2 grandchildren. I was not, by any measure, brave. But I typed back yes anyway, because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is answer a question honestly. The second date was at a dim-sum place in Sunset Park that she had identified through what I would later learn was a comprehensive analysis of every food-related review posted online for the borough of Brooklyn, cross-referenced against descriptions of texture, flavor, temperature gradient, and the specific social dynamic of communal ordering. She had a lot of systems. This was something I was beginning to understand about her. Everything she did was preceded by research, and the research was always more thorough than necessary, and the thoroughness was not anxiety but love. The love of a person who has spent 4 centuries learning how to pay attention. She arrived before me. This was the second time. Later she told me she always arrived first because waiting for someone was less expensive than being the one who was waited for. I unpacked what that meant across about a week of thinking about it and never arrived late again. We ordered in the communal way, pointing and nodding, and occasionally asking the woman rolling the cart to stop and describe something. Sira asked questions about every dish. Not performative questions, not tourist questions. Actual focused inquiry about the Maillard reaction on the char siu, about the pleating technique on the har gow, about the specific social occasion that soup dumplings were traditionally associated with. The woman with the cart answered all of them, and by the 4th cart she had started stopping at our table first. "You ask better questions than anyone I've served in a long time," the woman told Sira. "I'm interested in everything you make," Sira said simply. "It shows thought." The woman beamed and brought us something off menu that turned out to be extraordinary, and Sira ate it with the focused attention she brought to everything and said quietly, mostly to herself, "The compression of culture into a gesture of hospitality. This is what my briefings missed entirely. The food thing. The accumulation of meaning in small acts," she said. "Your species layers it. Every meal has history. Every dish carries a set of associations that are not written down anywhere, that exist entirely in the lived experience of eating it in the right place with the right people." She looked at the soup dumpling she was holding. "We cataloged the cuisine. We missed what the cuisine was for." "It's for feeding people," I said. "Yes," she said. "Exactly. It's for feeding people. Something that obvious, we had it in the reports and still didn't understand it until I was sitting here." She ate the soup dumpling. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, the way people do when something is very good. Then she opened them and said, "I want to try everything." "There are 3 more carts." "I mean in general," she said. "I want to try everything in general." We agreed on a place. She picked it, a small restaurant at the eastern tip of Long Island, right on the water near Montauk Point. It was a 2-hour drive, on a Tuesday. I told my coworker Danny about it and he said that sounded like the setup to a murder podcast, and I said probably, but her grammar was excellent and he said that was statistically irrelevant, and I agreed, and I went anyway. I got there at 7:15. The restaurant was older than it looked, low ceilings, fishing nets on the walls, a candle in a wine bottle on every table. The kind of place that had been sitting quietly at the edge of the continent for 50 years, watching the Atlantic, minding its own business. The hostess led me to a corner table, and I sat down and ordered a water and looked out at the darkening water and tried not to check my phone. She arrived at 7:22. I know the exact time because I was looking at my phone when the restaurant went quiet. Not silent, the kitchen was still running, the candles were still burning, but the ambient noise of 20 people eating and talking and living their ordinary lives softened, the way sound softens right before a thunderstorm. I looked up. She was wearing a long coat the color of deep water, buttoned to the throat. Her hair was silver white and fell past her shoulders, and it moved like it had its own opinions about gravity. Her skin was the pale gray of winter moonlight, not sick pale, not wrong pale, but the precise cool gray of something that had been made in a different light than this one. Her eyes, when she found me across the room and held the look without blinking, were gold, not amber, not hazel, gold like the center of a flame. She walked to my table and sat down across from me and folded her hands and said, in the most precise English I had ever heard, "You are Daniel Marsh." "Yeah," I said. "Hi. I am Seraphiel Vess of the Ethon Compact," she said. "But on this world I have been using the name Sira. You may use whichever you prefer." The candle between us flickered. "Sira," I said. The smallest thing happened to her face, not quite a smile, not quite relief, something between the two. "Good," she said. "I was not certain you would stay." I almost didn't. I looked at my water glass. I looked at her hands, which had too many knuckle joints, though they were elegant, and the skin between her fingers was very faintly webbed. I looked at her face. "You're not human." "No. The app orbit is ours," she said, without any particular emphasis. "We run it across several worlds. The questions are calibrated to identify specific characteristics: honesty, protectiveness, the capacity for loyalty under pressure." She paused. "You answered all three correctly." "There's a correct answer. There is the answer that reveals what a person is actually made of," she said, "which amounts to the same thing." The waiter arrived. He set down a bread basket and looked at Sira for exactly 1 second longer than he should have and then retreated. She picked up the menu and studied it the way someone studies a foreign language textbook, careful, thorough, a little bemused. "Are you hungry?" I asked. "I eat," she said. "I am not particularly hungry, but I have found that humans are more comfortable in conversations that are anchored to meals. It gives both parties somewhere to look when the talking becomes difficult." I laughed. It came out shorter and more surprised than I intended. "What?" she said. "Nothing. It's just you're right. That's exactly right. I've never heard anyone say it out loud before." She looked at me across the menu. "I have been studying your species for 11 of your years," she said. "I find you considerably more interesting than my initial briefing suggested." "What did your briefing say?" She considered the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Chaotic, emotionally volatile, catastrophically short-lived. A peripheral species in a peripheral system with no strategic value and a troubling tendency toward both self-destruction and accidental innovation." "That's pretty accurate, actually." "I have come to think it undersells you," she said, and looked back at the menu. "We ordered." She chose the grilled fish and a glass of something sparkling and studied the candle flame with the focused attention of someone who had not seen one up close before. "I ordered the pasta and tried to figure out where to start. There were 1,000 questions. The one that came out was, why a blind date?" She looked up from the flame. "I beg your pardon." "The app, the setup, you clearly didn't need to go through orbit to find me. If you've been studying humans for 11 years, you could have just walked up to me on the street, or sent a formal, I don't know, an official introduction, an interstellar email, whatever." I gestured vaguely at the fishing nets and the candlelight and the small, perfect corner table she had picked. "Why this?" Something shifted in her expression. For just a moment the careful composure slipped, and beneath it was something that looked, startlingly, like nervousness. Because, she said, if I had introduced myself formally, you would have been responding to my title, my rank, my position. She looked at the candle again. I did not want that. I wanted to know if a person who knew nothing about me, who had no reason to be impressed or intimidated, would find me worth sitting across from. The restaurant had filled up around us. There was a couple by the window arguing quietly about directions. There were two old men at the bar watching baseball and complaining about the pitcher. The Atlantic was doing what it always does outside any window in any place, where people have been sitting and eating and falling in or out of love for 100 years. And I said, "You are still here," she said. "So are you finding me worth sitting across from?" "Yeah," I said, "very much yeah." She ate with 2 forks, one in each hand, and managed to make it look completely natural. I didn't comment. We talked for 2 hours. Not about interstellar politics or species classifications or whatever machinery had brought her to this particular restaurant at the eastern tip of Long Island on a Tuesday in October. We talked about the things you talk about on a first date when the date is actually going well, where you grew up, what you wanted to be as a child, what made you laugh, what you were afraid of. She had grown up on a station that orbited a gas giant the color of old brass. She had wanted, as a child, to be a cartographer of unmapped gravitational eddies. What made her laugh, it turned out, was very similar to what made me laugh. The precise moment when something that was trying very hard to be serious failed unexpectedly at it. What she was afraid of was harder to answer, and she didn't answer it directly, and I noticed, and I let it go. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, sitting across from her with my pasta getting cold and the candle burning lower, was that I was sitting across from the sovereign administrator of 3 galaxy clusters. That the Ethon Compact, which she had mentioned so casually alongside her name, was not a company or a civic organization or a diplomatic post, but the oldest and largest governance structure in this arm of the galaxy. That the ship that had brought her to Earth's orbit was the Vess Spire, a vessel approximately the size of a small moon, currently parked at the L2 point with orders to hold position and speak to no one until she returned. That the 11 years she had spent studying my species had been the equivalent, in her culture, of going rogue. A sovereign who abandoned her post to sit in research stations and walk through human cities, and eventually design a dating app that asked 3 questions calibrated to find someone specific. Someone honest, someone protective, someone who understood what loyalty meant. I didn't know any of that. I knew that her eyes were gold, and that she laughed with her whole face, and that she had eaten her grilled fish with 2 forks with complete unself-conscious dignity, and that when the waiter brought the check she looked at it with the expression of someone who has been told about the concept of a restaurant bill but has never actually encountered one. And I paid. And she said thank you with a gravity that suggested she understood it meant something more than the bill. We walked out into the October dark together. The lighthouse at Montauk Point was doing its slow rotation across the water. The parking lot was nearly empty. The wind off the Atlantic was cold and smelled like salt and distance. "This is where I would normally ask if I could see you again," I said. "Yes," she said. "It is. I'm asking." She stood at the edge of the parking lot and looked out at the lighthouse and then back at me, and something in her face was doing that thing again. The careful composure held slightly too carefully, like a door being held shut from the inside. "Daniel," she said, "there are things I need to tell you." "Okay." "Several of them are large." "Okay." She turned to face me fully. The lighthouse swept its beam across the water behind her, and in that fraction of a second when the light caught the angles of her face, she looked ancient and extraordinary and quietly afraid. "I came to this world for professional reasons," she said. "There was a situation requiring assessment. An evaluation of whether your species was prepared for formal introduction into the wider galactic community." She paused. Those are the official reasons. And the unofficial ones. I was lonely, she said, and the simplicity of it hung in the salt air between us. I am the most senior administrator in my branch of the compact. There is no one in my position who is not lonely. The work does not leave room for. She stopped. I saw what your species had built. Art, music, the way you cook things, the way you grieve and rebuild and cook things again. I thought there might be someone here who, another stop. She was not someone who left sentences unfinished. The pauses were costing her something. I used an inappropriate amount of compact resources to design that application, she said finally. I would like you to know that up front. How many galaxies worth of resources? I asked. She looked at me sharply. You said 3 earlier, I said. When you gave your name, Ethon Compact. I looked it up on my phone in the bathroom. There's one result, on a forum that's usually about cryptids and government cover-ups, and it says the Ethon Compact administers 3 galaxy clusters. The silence that followed was extraordinary. You researched me, she said, during the dinner. I research everyone. I'm an accountant. Due diligence is basically my personality. And you, she stopped again. You came back to the table. Of course I came back to the table. You were the most interesting person I'd ever had dinner with. The fact that you run 3 galaxies seemed like a reason to ask more questions, not fewer. She looked at me for a long moment with those gold eyes that didn't blink at the ordinary human rate, and the lighthouse kept its slow rotation, and the Atlantic kept doing what it always does, and then she said, very quietly, "You are not what I expected." What did you expect? Fear, she said, or performance. Humans who learn what I am either become frightened or they begin performing, trying to impress, trying to leverage, trying to become useful. It is exhausting. It is one of the reasons I built the application without disclosing my identity. I'm not going to lie, there's some fear, I said. There's a non-trivial amount of what is happening going on right now, but I stopped and looked at the water. You were nervous. At dinner, when you talked about the blind date thing, about wanting someone to find you worth sitting across from without the title, that was real. Yes. That's what I came back to the table for, I said, not the 3 galaxies. She was quiet for so long that I thought I'd said the wrong thing. The wind shifted and the temperature dropped, and somewhere behind us a car started and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving us more alone in the October dark. Then she said, I would like to see you again. Yeah, I said. I'd really like that. I drove home from Montauk at 10:30 at night with the heat on full blast, and the radio off and the Long Island Expressway mostly empty around me. The sky was very clear. I had never paid particular attention to the sky before, not the way I was paying attention to it now, with the specific and newly activated awareness that it was full. That there was something up there beyond the satellites and the atmospheric layers and the slow, cold arithmetic of distance. Something ancient and organized, and apparently very interested in whether I thought loyalty was important. At some point around exit 52, I said out loud to the empty car, "Okay." Just that, just okay. The same thing I'd said at the table when she told me she was 412. I don't think I was being brave. I think I was doing the thing people do when something is too large to hold all at once, which is to hold just the piece that's in front of you right now and let the rest wait. The piece in front of me right now was, I had met someone interesting. She had also found me interesting. There had been a dinner. The rest could wait. I got home at midnight. Gerald was on the counter and knocked a mug to the floor when I came in. I picked up the mug and gave Gerald a piece of chicken from the fridge and stood in my kitchen in Flushing, Queens, and thought about 2 forks and the specific way the lighthouse had moved across her face, and then I went to bed. The second date was 3 weeks later. I mention this because a lesser account would skip straight to the revelation and the grandeur, and miss the weeks in between, which were, in their own way, the point. We texted. This is a more extraordinary sentence than it sounds. The sovereign administrator of 3 galaxy clusters texted me about her day. She was a precise and careful writer who occasionally dropped into a formal register when discussing something that mattered to her, and then caught herself and added a period and the word asterisk anyway and moved on. She asked questions the way people ask questions when they actually want to know the answer, not when they're waiting for their turn to talk. She remembered things I mentioned in passing. My cat Gerald's ongoing campaign to knock things off my counter, the project at work that was making me want to eat lunch at my desk, my mother's Sunday calls, and asked follow-up questions about them with the thoroughness of someone who had filed them carefully and retrieved them deliberately. I did not know during those 3 weeks the shape of what was moving around us. What I found out later, the compact had standing protocols for any sovereign administrator who initiated contact with a precontact species. The protocols involved oversight committees, multiple layers of approval, a review process that took, on average, 40 of Earth's years. What Sarah Fielves of the Ethon Compact had done was none of those things. She had built a covert application, deployed it on a world the Compact had not yet formally acknowledged, used sovereign-level computational resources to do so, and had been conducting unauthorized first contact with an individual human citizen for 11 years. There were, by the time of our first dinner, 17 separate formal complaints filed with the Compact Oversight Board by 3 different administrative factions. There were also, apparently, 4 competing theories about what she was doing and why, none of which were correct. What she was doing was having dinner with me in a Thai place in Midtown on a Wednesday night, and asking me to explain what an audit was, and listening to the explanation with the focused attention of someone for whom paying attention to things was not a social performance but a genuine practice. On the 3rd date I showed her Central Park. It was November by then, cold and bright, the trees stripped down to their architectures. We walked the loop and she asked about the runners, not why they were running, but the specific human relationship to running that was not about being chased, the voluntary exhaustion, the way a person's face looked in mile 4 when the body had stopped arguing and the mind had gone quiet. I tried to explain it and couldn't entirely, and she nodded like this was useful data and said she had wondered about that. We stopped at the reservoir and looked at the water. A man was walking a very small dog that was absolutely convinced it was a large dog. Sierra watched the dog for a moment with an expression of absolute delight. "Your companion animals are extraordinary," she said. Gerald would take exception to being called extraordinary. Gerald is extraordinary precisely because he doesn't know it. She turned back to the water. That is a very human quality, being remarkable without performing remarkableness. I looked at her profile against the late autumn skyline. "Is that why you're here, that quality?" She considered it. "Partly," she said. "Your species is the only one we have encountered that produces art specifically intended to be experienced after the artist is dead. The assumption that there will be people to hear the music, to read the words, centuries from now. It requires an extraordinary faith in the future. Or denial about mortality." "Perhaps they are the same thing," she said. On the walk back she told me about the station she'd grown up on, the brass-colored gas giant turning slowly outside the observation windows. She'd had a tutor who believed that the most important thing a person of her station could learn was cartography. Not the cartography of space, though that too, but the cartography of agreements, of obligations, of what you owed to whom and why. He had died when she was young, and she had kept his maps on her office wall for 120 years. 120 years, I said. "Yes." "How old are you?" She looked at me sideways. "How old do you think I am?" "I genuinely cannot tell. You eat with 2 forks and you've had the same office wall for 120 years, and you built a dating app to find someone specific and you're nervous about first dates. I have no reference points." She was quiet for a moment. In your years, she said carefully, I am approximately 412. The path crunched under our feet. A jogger passed. Okay, I said. Okay. I mean okay. You're 400 years old. 412. Right. And you still get nervous on first dates. I have been on 3 first dates, she said, in 400 years. The previous 2 were, she made a small gesture with her left hand, a gesture I'd started to recognize as the equivalent of a shrug. Political arrangements that did not survive contact with the actual people involved. That sounds lonely. Yes, she said, it was. We were at the south end of the reservoir, the city rising up around us, the cold November light going gold and then pink in the west. I had a very clear sense of the ground under my feet, the specific solid particularity of the earth, the park, the continent, this one point in a universe that was apparently much more crowded and political than I had understood when I woke up that morning. I'm 31, I said. Yes. In your years I'm young, she said. Yes. That doesn't bother you. She turned to look at me fully, and the gold of her eyes caught the sunset, and for a moment she looked exactly like what she was, something ancient and precise and genuinely curious about the answer. When I was studying your species, she said, I read the reports of my analysts with one half of my attention, and then I read the literature they had collected with the other half. Your poetry, your music, your novels. There is a particular human experience that comes up again and again in all of it, across every culture and century I reviewed. She paused. The experience of standing in front of something real after a long time of standing in front of things that weren't. I looked at her, she looked at me. The wind off the park was cold. No, she said, it doesn't bother me. The walk back from the reservoir took longer than it needed to. We stopped twice. Once because she wanted to watch a street musician who was playing something slow and complicated on a guitar held together with what looked like electrical tape, and once because she wanted to sit on a bench near the Delacorte Theater and look at the light failing in the tree line for a while. Both times I said nothing and sat or stood next to her and let the thing go at whatever pace it needed to go. My mother called the next Sunday and asked how things were going, and I said fine, and she said I sounded different, and I said I wasn't, and she said Marco's eldest had just started walking. And I said that was great, and she said, are you sure you're all right? And I said, yes, Mom. I promise, I'm better than all right. And she was quiet for a second in the way that meant she was deciding whether to ask more. And then she said, okay, honey, I love you. And I said I love you too, and we hung up. And I sat in my kitchen with Gerald on the counter looking at me with his habitual expression of mild contempt. And I thought about what it would mean to try to explain any of this to my mother. And then I thought that the explaining would have to wait, and that was fine. Because the thing itself was real regardless of whether it was explained yet. I had started without particularly deciding to, bringing her things. Small things, a book I thought she'd find interesting, a piece of food I wanted her to try, a photograph I'd taken of something that seemed like the kind of thing she'd want to see. She received all of them with the same focused attention she brought to everything, the same quality of actually receiving rather than just accepting. She kept the book. She kept the photograph. She told me she had put them on her desk on the Vest Spire, which she mentioned so casually that it took me a moment to register it. There was a ship the size of a small moon parked somewhere in Earth's orbital vicinity, and she had put a book I gave her on the desk in her office there, and that was apparently the most natural thing in the world. You have an office on a ship, I said. I have several offices, she said, on the ship and on various stations. This is the one I work from most frequently. She paused. The photograph is by the window. There is a very good view from there. What's the view of? Currently, your planet, she said. I tried to imagine what Earth looked like from the L2 point and couldn't quite get there, and she saw me trying and said, blue and white and very alive. It looks like it is doing something. Many planets don't. I met her staff on the fourth date. This was not planned. We were at a coffee shop on the Upper West Side. I had been explaining espresso, which she found conceptually interesting and then physically confronting, when four people walked in who were clearly not from Earth and were clearly trying very hard to look like they were from Earth, and failing. Because they had the same gray skin and too many jointed hands, and the specific bearing of people who were extremely senior in an organization, and were currently doing something that extremely senior people in organizations do not normally do, which was walking into a coffee shop on the Upper West Side and looking at Sierra with expressions that balanced carefully between professional neutrality and an emotion I eventually identified as profound relief. Sierra set down her espresso and looked at them, and said something in a language that sounded like running water and broken glass in equal measure and with considerable energy. They said something back, several things, then they all looked at me. "This is Kale, Min, Torvith, and Sierra's second adjunct Pry," I said. "Right." All four of them looked at Sierra. "He researches people," she said in English, with a tone that was close to fond. Kale, who turned out to be her chief of staff and had clearly been looking for her for some time, sat down at our table without being invited and said, in very precise English, "Administrator, the Oversight Board has filed a fourth motion. There will need to be a formal session." "I know," said Sierra. "The deadline." "I know," she looked at me. Then back at Kale. "Schedule it for next week. I will attend by relay. I am not leaving yet." Kale looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully decode. It wasn't hostile. It was the look of someone who was calculating variables they didn't have complete information for, and who was professional enough not to say so. "Daniel," Sierra said, "I owe you an explanation." "Seems like it," I said. "Several explanations." "I've got time." I looked at the four of them. "Does anyone else want a coffee?" It's confronting, but in an interesting way. We sat in that coffee shop for 3 hours. They explained the compact, not the official history, which Sierra had given me in pieces, but the current situation, the one that was apparently moving around us like weather we hadn't seen yet. The Oversight Board and its 17 complaints, the 4 competing theories about what she was doing, the formal session that was now scheduled for the following week in which the senior administrator of the Ethon Compact would have to explain, to a committee of extremely old and extremely serious people, why she had spent 11 years and a non-trivial amount of sovereign resources on unauthorized first contact with an individual human accountant in Flushing, Queens. Kale explained this with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it in the hope that a rehearsal would make it smaller, and it didn't. Pry, the second adjunct, kept looking at me with an expression of extreme scientific interest. Min and Torvith said almost nothing, and ate the scones I ordered with expressions of surprised satisfaction. "What happens at the formal session?" I asked. "She answers the board's questions," said Kale. "And if they don't like the answers?" Kale and Prey and Min and Torvith all looked at Sierra. "Then there will be a formal censure," Sierra said, "and a supervised return to standard administrative protocols." She looked at the table, and the first contact would be officially classified as an anomaly and expunged from the record. The coffee shop was warm. A couple at the next table were arguing gently about a movie. Outside, the Upper West Side was doing its usual Saturday afternoon thing, entirely unaware that the administrative sovereign of 3 galaxy clusters was sitting in a window seat, explaining the bureaucratic machinery that had been quietly assembled around her small act of loneliness. "Expunged," I said. "Yes." "What does that mean exactly?" Kale started to answer. Sierra stopped him with a look. "It means," she said carefully, "that the compact's formal position would be that the contact did not occur. It would not affect your memory, but it would affect," she paused, "the continuation of this." "Yes." I looked at her for a long moment. She was very still. The espresso cup was empty in front of her, and she was not looking at me, but at a point slightly past my shoulder with the careful focus of someone who was controlling their face extremely deliberately. "When's the session?" I said. "Next Wednesday," said Kale. "And it's in front of the oversight board." "Yes." "Can I come?" The table went quiet. All four of Sierra's staff looked at each other and then at Sierra. Sierra's eyes came back to my face, and she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her before. Surprise, yes, but something else beneath it. Like someone who had prepared for a great many possible outcomes and had not prepared for this one. "You want to come to the session," she said. "You said the contact would be expunged if they don't like the answers. That seems like a thing I should be there for." "You are the contact," said Prey. "You are not a party to the oversight process. And yet it's my continued existence in this situation that's apparently on the table," I said. I looked at Sierra. "Right." "Yes," she said quietly. "Then I should be there. I can answer questions. I'm very good at answering questions in formal settings. I do it professionally. Well, not intergalactic oversight board questions, but the principle's the same." I picked up my coffee cup and found it empty and put it down. And if they're trying to decide whether this was a mistake or not, they should hear from the person who was on the other side of the dinner table. Another silence, longer this time. Kale's expression had shifted from calculating to something that was, I thought, close to respect. "The board," said Kale slowly, "has never been addressed by a precontact species representative. Is that a rule, or just something that hasn't happened?" Kale looked at Sierra. "The latter," said Sierra. "Then take me," I said. The night before the session I couldn't sleep. I lay in my apartment in Flushing listening to the street sounds, the car horns and the distant train and the particular acoustic signature of a city that never entirely stops, and I thought about what I was going to say. I didn't write notes. I'm not a notes person, which my supervisor considers a professional failing, and I consider a system that works for me because the notes are all in my head and they stay there. I went through the arguments the way I go through a complicated return, one line item at a time, no rushing, looking for what's actually there rather than what you expect to find. At around 2 in the morning, Gerald climbed onto the bed, which he very rarely did, and sat on my feet with the specific weight that cats use when they are communicating that you are allowed to stay. I looked at the ceiling. What were they actually asking? Whether the contact was legitimate, whether she had acted in good faith, whether the person on the other side of the contact was a valid party to it, someone capable of informed engagement, not a subject being acted upon, whether any of this was worth the complaints. The complaint about the resources I couldn't address. That was real, whatever the scale of it meant in a civilization whose accounting I couldn't fully conceptualize. The complaint about the protocols I understood but disagreed with. In the specific way, I disagreed with tax regulations that existed for good historical reasons, but had outlived their precision. The complaint about the contact itself, the unauthorized first contact with a precontact species, was the one I was going to walk into the session chamber and address directly, because it was the one I had something true to say about. She had made contact honestly. That was the thing. Not as an administrator, not as a political actor, not as a representative of anything. As herself. And you don't get many chances in your life to see someone as themselves cleanly, without the title and the position and the accumulated weight of what they're supposed to be. I had had the meal before I'd known anything. I had had 3 weeks of texts before I'd known anything. I had had Central Park and the soup dumplings and the street musician and the bench by the Delacorte Theater. All of that had been real before I'd known what it was sitting next to. The Compact's board could expunge the record. They couldn't expunge what I'd actually experienced, because it had already happened in the world, and the world keeps its own accounting independent of anyone's oversight protocols. At some point I slept. In the morning, I put on the suit I wore to client meetings, the good one, the navy one, the one my mother had told me made me look like I knew what I was doing. And I went to meet Kale and Prey at the location they had texted, which was a pier in Red Hook that was empty at 5 in the morning, and we went up. The vest spire was the size of a small moon and looked, from inside, like someone had taken a cathedral and repeated it 1,000 times in every direction, each repetition slightly different, carved from something that was not quite stone and not quite metal but had the qualities of both. I was on it for 6 hours before the session, and I spent most of those hours trying not to openly stare at everything while also openly staring at everything. And Prey walked with me and answered questions with the patience of someone who had been briefed that I asked a lot of them. There were 17 species represented in the wings of the corridor outside the session chamber. I know because I counted. They ranged from shapes I had approximate reference points for to shapes I did not, and they all watched me with various expressions of curiosity or professional neutrality as I walked past with Priya and Kale flanking me. And I tried to walk like I was not a human accountant from Queens who had gotten here by answering 3 questions honestly on a dating app. Sierra was already inside when we arrived. The session chamber was large enough to feel cosmological. The oversight board was 7 individuals of varying species seated at a curved table that described most of a circle, and they had the air of people who were very senior in a very old organization, and were currently doing something unprecedented, and were being precise about the whole thing. Sierra was at the center of the room, in a chair that was clearly designed for this purpose, formal, isolated, the chair of someone who was answering for something. She looked at me when I came in, and something in her face shifted in a way that made the whole room feel different. The board's senior chair was a being I will not describe because I do not have good enough language for it, and it spoke in a register that Kale quietly translated at my shoulder. We will hear the administrator's account of the unauthorized contact. We will then determine whether a formal censure is appropriate and whether the contact record is to be expunged. "May I address the board?" I said. The silence that followed was the largest silence I have ever been inside. All 7 board members looked at me. Several of the species in the gallery looked at me. Kale, beside me, went very still. The senior chair said something. Kale translated. The representative of the contacted species is recognized. I walked to the center of the room. I stood next to the formal chair, and I did not sit in it because it was Sierra's chair and not mine. I put my hands in my pockets, which I am aware was probably not the correct formal posture for an interstellar oversight session, but was genuinely the only way I knew how to stand in front of a large audience without shaking. "My name is Daniel Marsh," I said. "I'm a tax accountant. I'm from Flushing, Queens. About 2 months ago I went on a blind date at a restaurant in Montauk, and the person across the table from me turned out to be," I glanced at Sierra. She was watching me with those gold unblinking eyes. Someone I'd been looking for without knowing I was looking for her. I know that probably sounds like the kind of thing people say. I know it doesn't look like much from this angle. A precontact species, an unauthorized application, 17 complaints and a formal session. I looked at the board. But I was there. I was across the table, and I know what I saw. I told them about the dinner. Not the strategic version, not the political version. The actual dinner, the 2 forks, the way the lighthouse swept across the water, the question she'd asked about what I valued, and the nervousness underneath the composure when she explained why she'd done it this way. I told them about the texts over 3 weeks. About Central Park and the small dog that thought it was a large dog. About standing at the reservoir while she described standing in front of something real after a long time of standing in front of things that weren't. I said, "I don't know what your rules say about this. I don't know your protocols. I know that she used resources she wasn't supposed to use and started a contact she wasn't cleared to start, and that there are 17 complaints about it, and I understand why that matters to you. but I'd like you to consider the possibility that what she found is worth the complaints." I stopped. She came to this world because she was lonely and because she believed my species was worth knowing. Those are not usually the reasons people say they do things. Those are the actual reasons. I think that matters. I think it's worth something that the person who runs 3 galaxies took 11 years and all of this. I gestured at the ship around us, the board, the session chamber, the improbable everything of it, to sit across a table from someone and ask if they'd find her worth sitting across from. The board was quiet for a long time. The senior chair spoke, and Kale translated. "You are saying the contact was conducted in good faith." "I'm saying it was conducted honestly," I said, "which I think is harder." Another long silence. 2 of the board members were consulting quietly. One was looking at me with an expression that I couldn't read, but that felt, surprisingly, like something that might have been amusement. The senior chair spoke again. Kale translated, "The board will consider. We have one question for the contacted representative." A pause. "Do you understand what you are being asked to continue contact with?" "An administrator who runs 3 galaxies," I said, "who is 412 years old, who texts me about her day and remembers that my cat is named Gerald and thinks running is interesting because humans do it without being chased." I looked at Sira. She was still watching me. "Yeah, I understand." "And you are here voluntarily, no coercion." "I'm here because she would have sat in that chair and answered your questions alone," I said, "and I didn't think that was right." "Yeah, voluntarily." The board conferred. I stood in the middle of a chamber in a ship the size of a small moon and looked at Sira, and she looked back at me, and neither of us looked away. It took 11 minutes. Kale translated the ruling afterward. The formal censure was reduced to an administrative notation. The contact record would be retained rather than expunged. The Compact's Protocol Committee would be asked to develop a formal framework for sovereign-level personal contact with pre-contact species. This last part was apparently unprecedented, and there was something in the tone of it, even through translation, that sounded like the formal language that institutions use when something has happened that they did not expect and have decided to accommodate rather than erase. The board conferred for 11 minutes and 20 seconds. I know because I counted them. The senior chair spoke at length. Several board members spoke in response. At one point there was a quiet disagreement between 2 of them that Kale was too professional to translate, but that I could feel in the room like weather. At another point the member who had looked at me with something like amusement spoke for what felt like a significant amount of time, and the room's temperature changed slightly after, the way rooms do when something has shifted in the argument. I stood next to Sira in the middle of the chamber. At some point, quietly and without making it a thing, she moved her hand slightly so the back of it was against the back of mine, not a gesture for the board. Just a fact between us, that I was here and she was here and we were standing next to each other. I didn't move my hand either. 11 minutes and 20 seconds. Then the ruling, which Kale translated in a steady voice while the chamber processed out around us. The formal censure reduced to an administrative notation. The contact record retained. The protocol committee convened. And at the end, a single additional line that Kale paused slightly before translating. The board's formal acknowledgement that the contacted representative had provided testimony of substantive value to the review process, and that the testimony would be retained in the record of the session. My testimony in the record. 11 minutes of me standing in the middle of an interstellar oversight chamber, in a Navy suit, talking about soup dumplings and the Delacorte Theater, and why the nervous thing she did with her face during the first date was the actual point. In the record of the Ethon Compact, 9,000 years of records and now this. Kale, I said quietly as the chamber emptied, is that normal, retaining witness testimony from the contacted party? Kale looked at me with the expression I'd stopped trying to decode and had started reading more directly, which was, "This person is more careful than he looks." "No," he said, "it is not." Outside the session chamber, in the corridor with 17 species filing past, Sierra stood next to me and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You are the first human being to address the oversight board." "How'd I do?" "They are developing a formal framework," she said, "because of what you said." I just told them what happened. "Yes," she said, "that is what I said you would do." I looked at her. "You knew I'd want to come." "I hoped you would want to come," she said carefully. "I did not know, I did not want to presume." "You could have asked." "I was afraid," she said simply, "of what it would mean if you said no." The corridor was emptying around us, the species filtering back to wherever they needed to be, the great ship going about its ancient business in the dark between stars. Somewhere far below us, the Atlantic was doing what it always does, and in Queens my cat Gerald was probably knocking something off the counter, and my mother would call on Sunday. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." "The 3 questions on the app. What does loyalty mean to you?" She looked at me sideways. "That was the second question." "I know, I want to know your answer. You built the app. You calibrated the questions. What's yours?" She was quiet for a moment. Around us the corridor's light shifted, slow and tidal, the way light moves in a place built to hold 400 years of decisions. "It means," she said, "showing up in places you were not required to show up in." I thought about the coffee shop, the session chamber, the chair she had been sitting in alone until I walked in. "Yeah," I said, "that's mine too." She looked at me for a long moment with those gold eyes that saw clearly in the dark between stars. Then she said, "Would you like to see the observatory? It looks out at all 3. The 3 galaxies." "Yes." "Yeah," I said. "I really would." She turned and I fell into step beside her, and we walked through corridors that curved upward at their edges and past windows that looked out at depths I didn't have numbers for, and through a section of the ship that materializing briefly beside us, called the Memory Archive, which was a room the size of a stadium filled with something that was not quite light and not quite sound but was somehow both, and which contained, Sierra told me, the administrative record of the compact, going back approximately 9,000 years. 9,000 years, I said. "The compact was not always this large," she said. "The early records are very sparse. They get more complex approximately 6,000 years ago. There was a period of rapid expansion." She glanced at me sideways. "You are doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you try to hold a very large number and cannot, and the attempt shows on your face." "Sorry, 9,000 years is a lot of years." "Yes," she said, "it is." She paused at the entrance to the memory archive and looked into it. "I have been in this room alone many times. In the early hours of the ship's cycle, when the crew is sleeping and the administrative burden is low, I come here and look at all of it and try to understand what 9,000 years of decisions adds up to." She was quiet for a moment. "I think the honest answer is, less than you'd expect and more than you'd know what to do with. The same amount of trying. The same proportion of things going wrong for reasons you didn't anticipate. The same stubborn human." She stopped and looked at me. "The word I keep using internally is human, not our species word, yours." "Because of the 11 years." "Because of the 11 years," she confirmed. "I have borrowed your word for it. The quality of keeping going past the point where it makes strategic sense. I have been trying to find the equivalent in our language for a decade, and I have not found it. You have it natively in the word, in the concept. It is the right word for the thing I meant." We walked through a long corridor after that without talking, and it was the kind of not talking that is a conversation in itself. The kind where both people are thinking about the same thing and are comfortable enough with each other to let the thinking happen. The observatory was at the ship's forward point. The room was not large, not relative to the rest of the Vespire, but the observation panel was the entire outer wall, floor to ceiling, curved to follow the hull, and through it the 3 galaxy clusters of the Ethon Compact were visible, not as single points of light but as structures, as presences, as things that had shape and depth and the slow grandeur of objects that have been doing something important for longer than I had concepts for. 3 smears of light in the dark, each one containing more stars than I had numbers for, and all of that, under one administrative structure, under one set of agreements and obligations, under one person's desk with a photograph from Queens on the windowsill. I stood at the observation panel and looked at it for a long time. "This is what you manage," I said. "In a manner of speaking," she said. "What I actually manage is much more local. The decisions that reach my desk are the ones that have failed to resolve at every other level below me, which means I see only the hardest problems and none of the ordinary functioning. It is," she considered, "it is like being an appeals court for the universe." "That sounds exhausting." "It is," she said simply. I looked at the 3 galaxies. I thought about a dining table with a candle and a wine bottle. I thought about Gerald on my feet at 2 in the morning. I thought about what she had said at the session, the question about showing up in places you were not required to show up in, and about the suit I'd put on and the pier in Red Hook at 5 in the morning, and about the specific expression on her face when I'd walked into the session chamber and she'd realized I'd actually come. "What happens now?" I said. "In administrative terms," she said, "the formal notation will be filed. The protocol committee will convene. I will need to spend the next several months in sessions I have been avoiding." She paused. "In other terms, I was hoping you might want to have dinner again." I was going to suggest that. "There is a cook on this ship who has been studying Earth cuisines for 3 years, she said. "He began with your mother's culture and has worked outward from there. He is not yet confident in it, but he is," she glanced at me. "He is trying." "What culture is my mother's?" "Italian Sicilian," she said. "He is particularly focused on Sunday dinners. He believes Sunday dinner is I don't have the right word, a load-bearing institution." I laughed. It startled both of us. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from something landing precisely right. "My mother would love him," I said. "She would. I intend to tell her, eventually, that someone 9 light years away has been working to perfect her grandmother's Sunday gravy." She paused. "In the appropriate context and at the appropriate time. She's going to call me every Sunday for a year about that." "Yes," said Sira, and her voice was warm with something that was close to fondness. "I expect she will." I turned from the observation panel and looked at her, standing beside me in the observatory of a ship the size of a small moon, the 3 galaxies of everything she was responsible for glowing quietly behind her. "Sira," I said. "Yes." "I would very much like to have dinner with you again." "Yes," she said. "I would very much like that too." She turned and I fell into step beside her, and we walked through the ship that was older than any country on Earth, and she pointed at things and named them, and I asked questions and she answered them. And the stars outside the observation panels were not the stars I knew, but they were extraordinary, and I was where I was, and so was she. And that, in the end, is the only accounting that ever really matters: where you are, and who you are standing next to when you look out at the impossible dark and decide to stay.